Shalom, welcome back. Hopefully at this point you've watched the introduction to this series. I'm going to be getting into an alternative view of history. And this is something that I discovered when reading the book by Immanuel Velikovsky, Ages and Chaos. And the subtitle to the book is From the Exodus to King Akhenaten. So this book offers up an alternative view of history. And if you listen to the introduction, you kind of get a clue as to what that is. Velikovsky has an interesting theory, and his theory is that we know the history of the Hebrews from the Scripture, and so when we compare Egyptian history and Israelite history, because of a faulty chronology with regards to Egyptian history, we have actually placed the Israelite exodus and sojourn at the wrong point in Egyptian history. So most scholarly people place the end of the Middle Kingdom at around 1500 BC, and so Velikovsky is saying no, it should be at around 800 BC, and that Akhenaten, like Pharaoh Akhenaten, was actually he lived in the same time as Ahab, King Ahab from Samaria, and because the historians don't have the chronologies of these two nations lined up properly, when Israel is interacting with Egypt in the history of Egypt, we don't realize that that's actually the Israelites. We think it's somebody else. We think that it's the Canaanites that lived in Palestine before Israel. So we're going to get into this book, and we're going to go through some of the chapters. I'm just going to try to give you a highlight. I highly recommend getting this book and reading it. I'll put a link in the description where you can get a free PDF version of it to read. And of course, you can get a print copy on Amazon or any number of places. But it's a great book. I highly recommend it. So, at the dawn of their history, the Israelites, an unsettled tribe, came from Canaan to Egypt. There they grew to be a people. There also they bore the yoke of bondage. Their eventual departure from Egypt is one of the most treasured recollections of their past, and their traditions tell its story numerous times. The annals of Egypt, we are told, did not preserve any record of the sojourn of the Israelites or of their departure. It is not known when the Exodus occurred, if it happened at all. A few scholars have expressed the opinion that the sojourn of the Israelites, their bondage, and their departure are mythological motifs. The absence of direct reference to these events on Egyptian monuments and papyri seem to corroborate this view. So, the traditional view of the Israelite Exodus is that there's no history of it in Egypt. And Mr. Velikovsky is going to refute that claim. It says historians disagree as to the date of the Exodus, and many hypotheses have been proposed, but for more than 2,000 years, they have agreed that the Exodus took place during the period called in present terminology the New Kingdom of Egypt. So Egypt's past is divided into the following periods: the pre-dynastic period, belonging mainly to the Neolithic or to the late Stone Age. The Old Kingdom, when most of the pyramids were built. The fourth dynasty of Cheops and the sixth of Phiops are the best known of the Old Kingdom. Let's see. First, Interregnum, when the land fell into chaos. Central authority was abolished in the Stark Age, and of the dynasties from the 7th to the 10th, almost nothing is known. So this was like a dark period in Egyptian history. Then comes the Middle Kingdom, comprising the 11th, 12th, and 13th dynasties. Feudal Egypt was united under the 12th dynasty, and Egyptian literature reached a height never again to be attained. 5. Another period of chaos, exploited by certain invaders known as Amu in Egyptian and called Hyksos by authors writing in Greek. The Hyksos kings were pharaohs of the 14th to the 17th dynasties, and they ruled over Egypt without mercy. It is not known of what race they were. And sixth, the New Kingdom. The Hyksos were expelled at the time of Ahmose, or Ammaeus I, who founded the 18th dynasty, the most renowned of all. The dynasty of Thutmose I, the famous queen Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, the greatest of all Egyptian conquerors, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, and the builder of magnificent temples at Luxor and Karnak, and Amenhotep IV, who called himself Akhenaten. He's also known as the Great Heretic. The Epigoni followed. Among them, the young king Tutankhamun is best known, not because of the distinction of his reign, which is obscure, but because of the riches in his tomb, discovered early in the 20s of this century, which it would have been the 1920s of the 20th century when this book was written, and because of the mystery that has surrounded his burial place. So, of course, everybody knows about King Tut. That's who this King Tutankhamun was, or Tutankhamun. The 18th dynasty declined under conditions that are not sufficiently known, and history records that in the 19th dynasty, that of Seti the Great, Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, and Merneptah followed. The period of transition from the 19th to the 20th dynasties is obscure. Among the kings of the 20th dynasty, Ramesses III was the most prominent, and he was the last great emperor of ancient Egypt. So please forgive any butchering of the names that I've done. I'm not obviously an expert on Egyptian history. Then we go on to number 7. The pharaohs from the 21st to the 30th dynasties were small kings who left no important records, and their age is called the Late Period. Some of these pharaohs, we are told, led armies against Palestine and Babylonia. However, the sources are usually not Egyptian, but for the most part scriptural. Some of these dynasties were Libyan or Ethiopian. Later ones, from 525 BC, were under Persian supremacy. Still later ones rebelled against the Persians. The last native king was removed by the Persians in 342 BC, and in 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great. And the last period of Egyptian history is the Ptolemaic dynasty of the descendants of Ptolemy, a general of Alexander, which expired with Cleopatra in 40 BC. The present work covers the time from the end of the Middle Kingdom to the conquest of Egypt by Alexander. The periods marked above as 5, 6, and 7, which is over 1,000 years of history in the ancient East. So as we go through the study on ages and chaos, that's the 3 periods that we're going to be studying, is the ones 5, 6, and 7. So, in a previous work by Emanuel Velikovsky, known as Worlds in Collision, he goes into a deep study of the Exodus, and he proves, in my opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the Exodus was not a cakewalk. So if you've ever seen the movies like the Ten Commandments, or pretty much any movie about the Exodus, when the Israelites come out of Egypt, they're walking out, it's blue skies, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and they're walking out with their, carts and covered wagons and whatnot, and they've, the children are singing and dancing because they're free, and everyone's smiling and happy. But Velikovsky in Worlds in Collision, he makes a good case for the fact that the Exodus was actually a time of calamity, earthquakes, pestilence, hurricane-force winds blowing, utter chaos. So we are going to briefly touch on that information, but for more information, I recommend picking up a copy of Ages and Chaos, which really goes into detail. So, the biblical story does not present the departure from Egypt as an everyday occurrence, but rather as an event accompanied by violent upheavals of nature. Grave and ominous signs preceded the Exodus. clouds of dust, smoke darkened the sky, the dust tore wounds in the skin of man and beast. Vermin and reptiles bred and filled the air and earth. Wild beasts, a terrible torment of hailstones fell, and a wild fire ran upon the ground. Swarms of locusts, blasts of cinders, day and night and day. And the gloom grew to a prolonged night, and blackness extinguished every ray of light. Then came the 10th and most mysterious plague. The angel of Yeshua, the angel of the Lord, passed over the houses of the children of Israel. The Israelites were pursued by the army of the king, who regretted their escape. They were trapped between the mountains and the sea. The night was frightful. A heavy cloud darkened the sky, which was rent by incessant lightning. A hurricane raged the whole night, and at dawn the sea was cleft. The waters torn by a double tide of gigantic force, the slaves passed through. The pursuers followed in chariots, but the waters returned, and the Egyptians with their king, fleeing against them, met their death in the waves. So it was a pretty shocking event. The extra-biblical sources that Mr. Velikovsky brings out make a case for this period of tremendous calamity, not just in Egypt, but throughout the earth. And even the scripture itself, if you look at the descriptions of the Exodus outside of the book of Exodus itself, you'll see that it was a time of calamity, according to the scriptures. Psalm 18, the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of hills moved and were shaken. Smoke and fire, coals were kindled, the channels of water were seen, and the fountains of the world were discovered. Psalm 97, his lightnings enlightened the world, and the earth saw and trembled. The hills melted like wax. He removeth the mountains, he overturneth them in his anger. He shaketh the earth out of her place. The earth trembled, the mountains melted, even that Sinai. Of course, this was from the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest parts of Scripture. We get this description of that even Sinai itself melted. Psalm 77, I call to remembrance my song in the night. Will the Lord cast off forever? Hath Elohim forgotten to be gracious? I will remember thy wonders of old. The depths also were troubled. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thou leddest thy people like a flock by the hand of Moshe and Aharon. Thou hast made the earth to tremble. Thou hast broken it. Heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. So you can see that, contrary to the picture that we see in the movies of the Israelites calmly walking out of Egypt, it wasn't quite like that. It was a very terrifying, cataclysmic type of event. So the logical question to be asked here is this testimony entirely false? And if it is not a collection of misleading inventions, can it be that nothing of this was noticed by the Egyptians? I mean, could all of this have happened and the Egyptians not even bothered to write it down? It is not known under what circumstances the papyrus containing the words of Epur were found. According to its first possessor, it was found in Memphis, by which is probably meant the neighborhood of the pyramids of Saqqara. In 1828, the papyrus was acquired by the Museum of Leiden in the Netherlands and is listed in the catalog as Leiden 344. In 1909, the translated text was published by Alan H. Gardinet, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, under the title, The Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage from Hieratic Papyrus in Leiden. Gardinet argued that all the internal evidence of the text points to the historical character of the situation. Egypt was in distress, the social system had become disorganized, violence filled the land, invaders preyed upon the defenseless population, the rich were stripped of everything and slept in the open, and the poor took their possessions. It is not merely, it's no merely local disturbance that is here described, but a great and overwhelming natural disaster. So this is from the translator of this document, who as far as we can tell, did not relate any of this information back to the Exodus. So Gardier interprets the text as though the words of the sage named Epur were directed to some king, blaming him for inactivity, which has brought this confusion, insecurity, and suffering to the people. The Almighty, to whom Epur directs his word, is a customary appellation of great gods, because the introductory passages of the papyrus, where the author and his listeners would be likely to be mentioned, are missing. The presence of the king listening to the sage is assumed on the basis of the preferred form of certain other literary examples from the Middle Kingdom. So I highlighted that about the Middle Kingdom, and it's just something to keep in mind as we go through this study, that this papyrus was dated toward I mentioned earlier when we talked about the Middle Kingdom that the literature of Egypt reached a point during the Middle Kingdom that it never attained again. And so this papyrus that was discovered actually matched the literary examples of the time. So reading just a papyrus based upon the internal evidence of it, you would be most likely to date it toward the middle, or to the Middle Kingdom. The papyrus is a script of lamentations, a description of ruin and horror. For instance, in the papyrus it says, "Forsooth the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. The towns are destroyed. Upper Egypt has become dry. All is in ruin. The residence is overturned in a minute. Years of noise. There is no end to noise." So you see that there is death and destruction everywhere. He goes on to say, "Oh, that the earth would cease from noise and tumult be no more." So what do noise and years of noise denote? The translator wrote, there is clearly some play upon the word, the Egyptian word for noise here, the point of which is to us obscure. Does it mean earthquake and years of earthquake? In Hebrew, the word ra'ash signifies noise, commotion, as well as earthquake. Earthquakes are often accompanied by loud sounds, subterranean rumblings and roarings, and this acoustic phenomenon gives the name to the upheaval itself. Apparently the shaking returned again and again, and the country was reduced to ruins. The state went into sudden decline, and life became unbearable. The papyrus of Epur contains evidence of some natural cataclysm accompanied by earthquakes, and it bears witness to the appearance of things that happened at that time. So I shall compare some passages from the book of Exodus and from the papyrus. And so by comparing these passages, Velikovsky is going to make a case that the papyrus is actually describing the Exodus, or the plagues before the Exodus itself. Papyrus. Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Exodus 7:21. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. This was, of course, the first plague. The river is blood. All the waters that were in the river turned to blood. So the water was loathsome, and the people could not drink it. Men shrank from tasting human beings and thirst after water. And the Egyptians digging round about the river for water to drink, and they could not drink the water of the river. The fish in the lakes and the river died. The worms, insects, and reptiles bred proficiently. And the river stank. That is our water. That is our happiness. What shall we do in respect thereof? All is in ruin. The destruction of the fields is related in these words. And the hail smote every herb of the field, and brake every tree of the field. Trees are destroyed, no fruit, and no herbs were found. The portent was accompanied by a consuming fire. Fire spread all over the land, and the fire ran along the ground. There was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. The papyrus says that forsooth gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. The fire which consumed the land was not spread by human hand, but fell from the skies. By this torment of destruction, according to the Exodus, The flax and the barley were smitten, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was boiled. But the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not grown up. And the papyrus says, Lower Egypt weeps, the entire palace is without its revenues. To it belong by right wheat and barley and geese and fish. So you see the reflection of the destruction of the crops in the commerce of the land. Exodus 10:15. There remained not any green thing in the trees or in the herb of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. No fruit nor herbs are found. Hunger. Forsooth, grain has perished on every side. Forsooth, that has perished which yesterday was seen. The land is left over to weariness, like a cutting of flax. Now notice that it says that the crops and fields were destroyed in a single day. In other words, where it says where yesterday was seen. The crops were seen yesterday, but they're destroyed today. So this excludes drought, which the usual cause of bad harvest. Only hail, fire, or locust could have left the fields as though the cutting of flax. The plague is described in Psalm 105, 34 through 35 in these words: The locusts came, the caterpillars that were without number, and did eat up all the herbs in the land, and devour the fruit of the ground. And the cattle were in a pitiful condition. Exodus 9:3 says, The hand of Yeshua is upon thy cattle which is in the field. There shall be a very grievous pestilence. The papyrus says, All animals, their hearts weep. Cattle moan. Hail and fire made the frightened cattle flee. It says, Gather thy cattle and all thy has in the field, and he that regardeth not the word of Yeshua left his servants and his cattle in the field. The papyrus says, Behold, cattle are left astray, and there is none to gather them together. Every man fetches for himself those that are branded with his name. The ninth plague, according to the book of Exodus, covered Egypt with profound darkness. It says in Exodus 10, there was a thick darkness on all the land of Egypt, and the papyrus says, the land is not light. Not light is an Egyptian equivalent to without light or dark, but there is some question as to whether the two sentences are entirely parallel. The years of wandering in the desert are described as spent in gloom under cover of thick clouds. The Jewish written tradition persists that for a number of years after the Exodus, the light of the sun was dimmed by clouds. It is rather this biblical shadow of death to which the quotation of the papyrus seems to parallel. The Egyptian parallel to the plague of impenetrable darkness will be found on a subsequent page in the shadow of death. We'll also have additional parallels. So the evidence, when found, brought forth more analogies and showed greater resemblance to the scriptural narrative than I had expected. This is Velikovsky speaking. He says, apparently, we have before us testimony of an Egyptian witness to the plagues. So now we come to the final plague. We're going to continue this next time, but I hope that this has kind of piqued your interest a little bit. And so when we return, we're going to get into the final plague and the children of Israel and their exit from Egypt and what the papyrus has to say about it. So thank you for listening. Shalom.